It would hardly be an exaggeration to say that Auguste Rodin forever changed the history of sculpture. Rarely had the medium so audaciously challenged the primacy of painting over the course of the 19th century. Long regarded as a dead medium of lifeless, inert material, sculpture in Rodin's nimble hands comes alive, breaking free from the plinths that traditionally separated sculpted figures in stone or marble from their earthbound beholders in flesh and blood. What makes Rodin's sculpture so modern, it's been said, is the way in which he makes visible an aesthetic of process, by taking traditional sculpture apart and putting it back together again. Strategies of multiplication, fragmentation, scalability, and recombinatory modes of assembly and display constitute some of the hallmarks of Rodin's artistic practice. Key to these various strategies is a relentless spirit of play and experimentation through a variety of materials: plaster, clay, stone, bronze, through the technical procedures of molding and casting. Perhaps the best, but also one of the most complex examples of Rodin's modernity is the Gates of Hell. Like the Museum of Decorative Arts in Paris, for which it was commissioned, the Gates of Hell was never fully realized. At the time of Rodin's death, it had remained a plaster model in the artist's studio, assembled only posthumously in bronze as a complete ensemble. This lack of finish wasn't for any lack of trying, though. Rodin had worked on the Gates of Hell continuously for almost 40 years, adding, subtracting, and modifying figures in an ever-changing narrative and spatial frame that was loosely based on Dante's Inferno, with its teeming denizens of tumbling, weightless souls. The fruits of this labor can be seen in several of Rodin's most iconic sculptures, scaled up and down across the various galleries of the Cantor, among them the three shades at the top of the portal and the thinker rotated at the top of the doors. For the art historian Leo Steinberg, the Gates of Hell constituted not just a masterpiece, but a referential storehouse, a Noah's Ark and dumping ground of Rodin's very best years of work. So what does it mean to say that Rodin had actually worked for almost 40 years on the Gates of Hell? This question of labor, I think, is really important. And it has a lot to do with these technologies of molding and casting that I've been talking about. Rodin used what was actually a rather ancient technology, that of lost wax casting. The most important part for my purposes here is that for Rodin, as for artists in Greek antiquity, for example, that original was actually a clay model. And it was the direct physical contingency between that clay model and liquid substances such as wax, plaster, or later on through various channels that were brought into the mold, the molten metal that would create the resultant cast, are incredibly important. And part of this has to do with the ways in which, since antiquity, through the Renaissance and up to today, we've thought about these technologies of molding and casting. Typically, they're seen as kinds of mindless or almost slavish techniques, ones that require skilled technicians who usually nevertheless remain anonymous in the process. And the idea is that because of this direct physical contact with the original of the artist, such as Rodin, there is very little to any chance for any kind of style on the part of the fabricator or the technician to be brought into the operative chain that makes up the final work of art. And for that very reason, I want to suggest Rodin's body of work and these technologies of molding and casting help us think about labor that's often erased in this process, and to really think about what we think we mean when we talk about an original. I want to suggest that Rodin offers us a challenging case to think about what an original means. If by an original, what we envision is an object, say a marble sculpture that bears the chiseled marks of the sculptor's hand, or else chased marble, that's to say a bronze sculpture that's been finished with tools after it's been cast, then very few, virtually none of Rodin's works would conform to such an idea. But originality can also be defined in other ways. The French government, for example, to which Rodin's estate had been ceded after his death, carefully controls, along with the Musée Rodin in Paris, what constitutes a legal original. And based on this, most of the objects of Rodin in the Cantor's collection are such authorized legal originals, according to the French government. But what does this mean? For some, these ideas of originality don't really have any currency for Rodin's work. They're anachronistic. That's not how Rodin himself thought of his work, it's been said. But for others, this kind of idea of originality is plainly part of a kind of myth or necessary fiction that we need to prop up the artist, say Rodin, in order to sort of preserve a European romantic tradition of pure, original authorship. Rodin's The Age of Bronze, represented in multiple versions at the Cantor, offers a compelling example of the fraught relationship between casting, authorship, and the status of an imputed original. First shown as a full-scale plaster in 1877, Rodin became furious when a critic had accused him of having cast the sculpture from life, something which reduced the expressive virtuosity of his own creation to that kind of aforementioned slavish or mindless technical ability. Two other versions of the Cantor might be compared to the first full-scale bronze, one that was reduced a little bit more than 50%, and an even smaller one that's actually made of plaster but was patinated in order to make it look as though it were bronze. And Rodin was actually deeply invested in the scalability, that is to say, of his work and of its scalar effects, how it would appear across different media and sizes and scales. In fact, one of his closest collaborators, Henri Lebossé, was famous for having developed a mathematically perfected technique with a special machine that could create subsequent counterparts in editions of this sculpture. But what this kind of technology affords in terms of the ease of replication, it creates another danger. That is to say that in addition to these authorized originals made after the original plaster, there might be unauthorized originals, that is to say originals in scare quotes, made from casts of casts, in this process that the French call surmoulage. And what happens in that process of surmoulage, for example, is that there can be a tangible, real distortion or change, both on the level of the surface topography of the sculpture and the details that it loses in subsequent casts, but also in the actual physical size of the sculpture that shrinks as the bronze cools. And there are other factors in play. Some of those original bronzes made during Rodin's lifetime used slightly different recipes from those authorized legal originals that were made today in the later 20th century. So some collectors prize the kinds of coloristic effects across the patinated bronzes of Rodin's lifetime. So despite the fact that they are made from the same originals, there is nevertheless an aesthetic difference between the lifetime casts and the posthumous casts, of which the Cantor and many other museums in the United States and across the world have filled their collections over time. Even beyond the highly technical complexities of bronze casting, Rodin's fondness for plaster casts, notwithstanding the fragility of the medium and its tendency to accrue a grimy patina of dust and dirt, signals a recursive relationship between issues of authorship and media. Take, for example, his portrait of Madame Fenaille, the wife of one of his most ardent supporters and patrons. Here we see how Rodin indexes the chisel marks that in the hair and at the base, and in doing so, reverently evokes Michelangelo, in particular his famous Non Finito sculptures, the dying slaves, that had so enchanted Rodin on his travels to Italy. These were sculptures, for example, that staged their unfinished state as a deliberate aesthetic, one that, in the case of the Renaissance master, foregrounded his Neoplatonic ideas of liberating his figures from their marmoreal, stony prisons. Yet what the dull plaster faithfully records in terms of its viscous, form-hugging materiality, it loses in terms of the luminous quality of marble, whose crystalline structure glitters and gleams in the light. And in so doing, Rodin draws attention to the differentiation of media that constitutes an enduring theme of his work. The magic of plaster, as Rodin shrewdly recognized, lay in its material capacity for manipulation, a manipulation not only of form, but also of space. And nowhere, perhaps, is this more evident than in Rodin's prodigious output of more than 150 plaster hands. And he would keep these hands in drawers and turn them about as if they were anatomical specimens or religious ex-votos for visitors who had come to his studio. And precisely because of their lightness, Rodin could use these hands in inventive ways in order to work out compositional problems in his larger sculptural ensembles. A photograph at the Cantor shows one of these hands strung up on a rig so that it hangs pendulously, at once defying gravity and making it visible. And it testifies to how Rodin thinks in space that's alternately positive and negative, like the negative molds and positive casts that comprise his working process. In contrast to the seeming weightlessness of the plaster hand in the photograph, a weightlessness that recalls the writhing figures strewn across the gates of hell, there is an emphatic heaviness in the bronze versions. One such example in the Cantor's collection, one that belongs to the exact same vascular left hand of Eustache de Saint-Pierre, part of Rodin's monumental work of the Burghers of Calais, offers a powerful example of this material and medial translation of plaster into bronze. Contrary to Rodin's usual practice, the mounting of these hands for museum display typically reorients them in such a way that transforms their liveliness of these detached appendages into intensely ponderous objects, heavy, serious, immobile. A bronze cast of Rodin's hand holding a torso offers an intriguing exception that ties together these interrelated themes of process, media, and authorship. Just 3 weeks before his death in 1917, Rodin consented to allow his assistant to make a plaster cast of his own hand from life. That same assistant later combined the hand with a female torso made by Rodin himself. So on the one hand, the addition of that torso enlivens the hand and orients it in space. But on the other, the juxtapositions are equally striking. Between, for example, the indexical traces of Rodin's own flesh, even more visible in plaster counterparts, and that of the expressiveness of the silky female nude. And it's perhaps unusual or ironic that Rodin would reconsider his lifelong aversion to life casting, particularly after the affair of the Age of Bronze. For on the one hand, the hand inevitably sets up a kind of aura of creative spirit of the artist. But at the same time, it evokes a kind of mortiferous quality, as a kind of fossilized, fetishistic part object of the same kind that Honoré de Balzac had memorialized in his famous short story, The Unknown Masterpiece. There, one of the interlocutors says to his friend, well, why don't you have set up one of the casts of the hands of one of your mistress? And what you'd see before you is a monstrosity, a dead mass, one that bears no resemblance to the living hand. And you'd want to have recourse to the chisel of the sculptor, who, without exactly reproducing it, would nevertheless bring to bear its movement and its life. And just as Balzac had sort of recognized, what we see, I think, in this amazing object is not only a kind of uncanny foreshadowing of Rodin's own death, but also a kind of deathliness of this uneasy synthesis between life casting on the one hand and expressive form on the other, that together, in the case of Rodin, make visible the stakes of molding and casting.